Boyson. I'm speaking to you on behalf of HCM Impact, also known as Raise the Tide. This is a group of subject matter experts from around the world talking about ISO standards, in particular, ISO standards related to human resources, and one in particular that is ISO 30414, the Human Capital Reporting Standard. We're joined today from California with my colleague, Doug Hoppe. Doug, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Brad.
Good to see you. And you are, how can I say, you are deep into people analytics. That is your wheelhouse, as they say. Is that fair comment?
Yes, it's been a very active time for people analytics, and I'm essentially a practitioner of that within Stanford University.
And if I'm not mistaken, you're also a member of the US TC 260 team. Is that correct?
I am.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I think you have an amazing background to speak in terms of these human capital standards and metrics. But maybe the best place to start is just a general introduction about yourself and your background for our audience, if you don't mind.
Okay. So I am the Director of Workforce and People Analytics within the University HR organization at Stanford University. And I've been doing that for about 4 years. I did something similar also in a high-tech company earlier. My background is a little unique in the sense that I've been in finance, IT, and HR. So I actually think all of those give me good perspectives in the people analytics work that I do today. I do actually see a lot of interest in finance, for instance, with the type of work that we do, because the investment in people is actually the biggest investment in most organizations. So when you think about it from just the value proposition, you can really get the interest of finance as well as HR in this field.
Isn't that so true? I mean, we've talked about for years different frameworks from an HR point of view, and the most vernacular and anecdotal is things like getting a seat at the table. A bit more specifically, we talk about speaking the language of business, and often that refers to the technical understanding of finance. And I think it's fair to say that we're in a period right now where there's an overlap between a lot of the areas of finance and HR in this people analytics space. Is that fair comment?
That's a very fair comment. And I think more and more it's going to be important to have a strong partnership between finance and HR for really coming up with some very powerful ways of quantifying what's happening in the business.
So you've obviously chosen to contribute your wisdom, your experience to this ISO 30414 standard and project. What was it about this project? Because it's all volunteers. What was it about this particular standards project that was enticing you to contribute and hopefully advance the professional practice of human capital?
About 2 years ago, I attended a presentation at one of these people analytic conferences. And the presenter was actually part of ISO. He's been part of ISO for quite a few years. And I was very interested in what he was presenting. So I caught him after his presentation. I said, hey, I'd like to, what is this ISO thing? I didn't even know about it actually at that time. And so he started explaining more his involvement and how it's been proceeding. And then he said, "Are you interested in contributing to this?" And I said, "Sure." So then so ISO basically gets you into teams. So So what I needed to do is basically join on behalf of the university HR organization at Stanford to the ANSI team. So it's the American team of ISO. So I've worked on different areas of that. I've been on some of the work groups, also on the communication side as well as another one. So I tried to stay active and updated through that process. And what I really like about the process is you get to meet a lot of people, with different expertise and perspectives. And it's great. It's great actually seeing not only the perspective in the US, but also across the globe.
Oh, that's so true. I mean, I think, I'm a Canadian living in Dubai, and I've worked all over the world. HR is my profession and my passion. But one of the things that I've seen, and the metrics back this up, is most people in the HR space are working in their country of citizenship, and their businesses, their operations are within that domain. They're not international or global practitioners, as much as we might like to think otherwise or wish otherwise, because we're connected with this internet, and we follow all kinds of things around the world. And one of the things that this project does is sort of open your mind to a broader way of looking at the practices of HR, human capital, and finance in a more objective and, dare I say, inclusive approach. Because it's no longer just about developing frameworks for your own sort of, whether you're in the education space of higher learning or whether you're in hospitality, healthcare. You really have to speak an inclusive language of business. And to your point of your background and the diversity, that one of the things that I've seen in the people who participate is that diversity of background. Said another way, very seldom do I see people with a very narrow focus understand the value add of this type of process. So that's sort of the background on the standard itself. Maybe if I can dive a bit deeper in some of the technical details of the standard, if you were to differentiate the development process of this standard and maybe the outcomes of the technical committees, how is that different perhaps than other ways other standards are either developed or positioned in the marketplace? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I still see the people analytics profession as still kind of a greenfield area. Actually, I mean,
Sure.
it's picking up a lot of momentum right now because when you see a number of different reports, you'll see that from a skill set just in HR, there needs to be a higher level skill in the future, with HR professionals, understanding data more and being able to get mentored in this. So there's an angle there. Leaders are asking more and more information about what's happening with people, because they see that's so important in their organization now. I mean, it's really the number one thing that can drive the success of your organization. So in many ways, we look at things from different perspectives to try to answer some of the questions around that. So ISO is providing, is providing a framework that I think will be very beneficial to this discipline and profession going forward, because it gives more weight and credibility to the work that we're doing. And you can, if you have standards, you can talk to that with leaders too. It's like, we're not just doing this here in this organization. We are also doing this in a way that's consistent with other organizations that we compete with, or have other arrangements with. So it's important that we get to a better level of consistency in the future about the way that we measure things. So that's what the ISO 3414 track is really trying to drive.
Yeah, and to add what you're saying is these are developed globally. So it's not like you have to, think of it like currencies, there's no currency conversion here. Once it's a published standard, it is a universal standard. And that's part of the challenge of the development of the standard, but it's also part of the strength of the standard. I think a lot of people working in HR make assumptions that a lot of the measures that they do, metrics otherwise, are already standardized. And it's only when they have more diversity of experience that they realize, no, well, this company's measuring turnover this way, this organization's measuring turnover this way, this organization is calculating the cost of turnover this way. And you all of a sudden you realize that we're not speaking the same language. And the power of the standard is what can we agree upon so that we can move forward and add value. So given your background and your experience, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, how can this be applied? I think in the development stage, there's a lot of sort of debate over what are the standards, but maybe you're in a position to give some examples of how people can actually apply a standard once it's published and in use.
So the ISO 3414 document really is pretty consistent in its scope with another concept that we have where we're trying to really be able to measure and pulse the entire employee life cycle. So from a kind of a work stream or a life cycle perspective, we look at it from a recruit to retire basis. So recruit even gets into the attraction, how are we attracting people to work at Stanford University? So I'm very active in one project right now, which gets into that. So the ISO document becomes a good reference point, to say, okay, we should start measuring these kind of things, and they're pointed out in the document, and they give some guidance as to, how to approach that. So I constantly have that document in front of me and some other related documents in the TC260 space to refer to. And sometimes, in discussions, I just say, right here, this is something we should consider, as we are approaching how we're trying to measure this particular piece of our activity.
Why do you think there would be resistance to that? And again, I'm making inferences. So I think there's certain stakeholders that are very open to, this standardization. But then I think it's fair to say that there are people who are, you point to an ISO document and they kind of they push back and for whatever reason. So I'm kind of getting into sort of some of the keywords of things like credibility, consistency. Why is that so important for organizations to appreciate, especially in terms of human capital?
So I see a bit of parallels between what I was used to in the finance area, where you had something like GAAP, the generally accepted accounting principles. And GAAP provides guidance, essentially, that I think without GAAP, it would be more difficult for finance to measure things, consistently with other organizations and have something that is useful for stakeholders, like external stakeholders, like shareholders and other investors, to get a pulse on how the organization is doing. So I see the stuff that we're doing with ISO, and by the way, even some of the stuff that's happening with the Securities and Exchange Commission now in the U.S. And I've also heard in other countries like Japan, where they are getting closer to having more requirements on human capital. So all of that should really have a premise that there's a guiding standard underneath that, so that when things are reported in this area, it is clear and understandable to the people that are reading it, and part of that is having consistency and credibility to what's being reported.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak for you. This is me speaking when I say this. I've said on different occasions that people who are good at HR or human capital or people operations, or the human side of the work environment, human capital, when they learn about this and or see this is a way for them to leverage their value add. They see it as a positive thing. That said, people who are maybe not as good, not as professional, not as objective, not as well intended, this level of accountability can be something that they didn't sign up for. This is something that is not necessarily how they defined the role and function of HR or human capital. So I often challenge HR people, in terms of the concept of, removing subjectivity from decision making. Isn't that a good thing? Isn't that something that we aspire for in recruiting and interviewing and measuring performance, in progressive discipline processes, grievances, however you contextualize it? We professionally want things to be more objective. Yet when that spotlight of objectivity is shone upon the person or the head of the HR human capital function, sometimes we push back and say, so I think that's part of the polarization in the community right now. And you explained very well in terms of the consistency and credibility of things. How can we better utilize the up and coming strengths of people analytics and standards to improve decision making and workplaces? Any thoughts on that question?
I think it's a process that practitioners need to work through within their organizations. It takes time, to. I think there's a level of proving yourself, proving yourself that you can deliver on things that are meaningful to leadership, and I agree with you. When you go through this process, people have different ideas. There in HR, I think there's a lot of individual thought. Let's put it that way. That people have, where they say that this is the way I'm thinking. You may be saying something else. Why? So it's a process. There's a lot of need for building relationships as you going along in this process. So it's not something that immediately clicks right away, unless an organization has kind of matured within their people analytics function. So, but I think a lot of organizations are at a stage, and our organization is too, where we're building up this function more and more as a key function within the organization.
You used a really key word just now that I want to drill in a bit deeper in terms of maturity or maturity curves. And I read a book a few months ago by some experts in people analytics. And one of the premises, I'm not going to mention the name or the book because I'm challenging it, is they said that the world we live in right now, in terms of people analytics, we do not have to go through the stages of an analytics or analysis maturity curve. Um, do you think that that is valid in the sense, you know, everything that I've learned in terms of progression or evolution of development of systems is you build upon. Things are built upon. You can't walk before you run. You can't train as an Olympic athlete without putting in the hours, doing the diet, and having the discipline, and obviously some element of genetics. One of the premises that they're putting forward now, and part of it is leaning towards technology, is that we can leapfrog some of these elements in the analytics maturity curve. What are your thoughts on that?
The way I think one of the keys is, and we've actually had to spend a lot of time on this,
Mm-hmm.
is building up our data foundation.
Yeah.
And that is so important, because no matter what you want to do, if you want to get into, a lot of the hype right now is on the predictive side. It's just to try to get more and more, but you really need to build that foundation for, as a key for anything. And part of the maturity is to continue to, enrich that foundation, because what we find is that more and more things are being asked for broader pieces of information. So we need to expand, to go out to a number of new systems that we haven't even thought about before, and pull that into our foundation. And the reason that's needed is a lot of the source data is just not in a way that you can utilize effectively for analytics, and even getting to the next point of predictive modeling capabilities. So I think no matter what, that has to be done.
Yeah, I'm in strong agreement. I especially, on so many topics, they often get presented in different environments as something new and unprecedented. Is this, whether it's ISO standards, whether it's people analytics, but there's a history to all of this. These things that are significant in a broad, impactful global sense don't just show up overnight. And as much as some people might consider different processes, technologies, ways of working very disruptive, remote work, for example, although there was a pandemic that really pushed people into this sort of work from home environment, it was still an option pre-pandemic, and people were in that sense already. It wasn't that new, and certainly people analytics builds upon data analytics, and data analytics preempts computers. That existed before we had this machine that helped us crunch numbers in a better way. So thank you. That was a question that I hadn't thought of in advance, but I wanted to get your thoughts on it. It sounds like we're in alignment with that. You have a role right now where you're supporting your organization and perhaps other stakeholders in that. How can people who are advocates for this, what is your, based on your experience, how can we do a better job on advocating for the value add of this, whether it's your employer, whether it's your stakeholder community, or like what we do for ISO, our professional community? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's one level, which is how you advocate people analytics in general. And some of this is actually at least what I'm finding is I'm not necessarily trying to advocate. What I'm doing is actually participating
Nice.
in a number of different um, efforts, that some of those are actually being driven by the top. Um,
Yeah.
and and so I'm always interested in being able to participate in the on the side of giving good, strong people analytics type information into maybe a broader topic. So we had a number of different things that particularly went on during the past couple of years, since the organizational dynamics changed so much.
Right.
So those were looking at not just people analytics, but other things as well. But incorporating the type of work that we do into that, all of a sudden, uh, it lightens up people's awareness, that we can start looking at that angle, and putting that and putting importance on that. So the visibility of the type of work that we're doing is important, and more I see that just naturally that visibility is happening. Now sometimes you have to drive it, so it's kind of like a push pull thing,
Yeah.
but sometimes it's organic, and I actually uh, that's that can be very helpful.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And obviously, by definition, you and I are donating our input into communities that are trying to advance this cause. But I've said this to many people, and I'm sure you have too, is people who want to see a change in a certain direction, get involved with the communities. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of time. And I'll call it this too. It's a lot of sacrifice, because it is, for the most part, voluntary. But unless you're willing to get involved with the community, you're not, being in, and I'll use a North Americanism. The armchair quarterback is not going to change anything, right? And so, I guess part of what I want to say is thank you for your contribution as well to this project over the years, and um, continuing to advocate and develop the better practices in the workplace. So we're coming to sort of the close of our session here. I wanted to ask you sort of a vision question. If these types of projects, or this project in particular, the ISO 30414, is raising the tide, how might we measure some of that success in a year or two from now? What kind of changes might we see in the work environment? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the ISO efforts are really hitting on some of the main themes that I see within organizations.
Hmm.
There was a newer standard that came out, ISO 3415, on diversity,
Yeah.
and diversity is continuing to be a very important area to address. So the work that we're doing in ISO is paralleling a lot of the um, areas that we see that are important. You mentioned flexible work. Uh, there's something that's kind of bubbling up on ISO for flexible work too, that could be um, could manifest itself into some sort of standard in the future. So ISO work is actually addressing a lot of the things that we see are the key things that we need to address in our organizations.
Yeah, yeah. You remind me of that expression, don't reinvent the wheel. And I think what happens in the human capital HR space, often around the world, is well-intended people come into this space, and we said it at the outset. Where do you go for guidance? What resources do you utilize to help you add value to your organization. And HR is a fairly young profession, if we, frame it as a profession. And these tools are designed. I developed a course last year, and one of the metrics that I wanted to include was employee turnover. And instead of just making the assumption, I've been doing HR for 20 years, I know what it is, I went back to the standard and looked at it and looked at the definition and said, hey, I wasn't actually going to use that definition, that metric, the way it was. I should use the ISO standard and stop making these assumptions. And you mentioned it earlier, going back to these resources aren't meant to inhibit or limit organizational or HR creativity and innovation. They're there to help you move beyond that and get the basics as a reference point, like you mentioned, in terms of financing GAAP or IFRS internationally. And people in finance often get this much faster than people in human resources. So thank you for making that point. Sort of in a final thoughts, any resources, any websites, any organizations that you might like to recommend to people watching to help them, whether it's in the people analytics side or the ISO 30414 human capital reporting?
Well, I think your point is trying to get involved in some way in community. I mean, every time I participate in an ISO meeting, I learn something new.
So true. So
There's
true.
so many things that you can learn from others. There's some great organizations as far as I particularly like a particular conference that is active. It's People Analytics. It's PAFOW actually. PAFOW.
How do you spell it?
PAFOW. People Analytics.
Yep, I've heard of it.
Yeah, and I don't remember what the last three mean. Conference board is really good.
Yes.
There's just you just look out for things, and then also try to get involved with maybe some more local groups. Like I belong to a Bay Area people analytics group, so those are good as well. And you really get, it's really interesting to see who participates in those too.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's really a mix of people, and you do see people not just in HR, but you see IT people, you see finance people, you see marketing people, you see quite a few people that are just generally interested in this area. So just try to look out for different things.
I love it. Love it. Get involved with community. Look at the interdisciplinary aspects of this. This domain, as many call human capital, is really a mix of many different things, certainly not just HR. And I think, to your point, if people are curious, do a little bit of research, find a community related to this, get involved. And certainly, we have, and you are the operator of the Human Capital Management Impact website. Thank you for doing that as well. And just thank you again for all of your support. Today, your comments, Doug, and your ongoing support with the TC, I want to thank you for that. And any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just keep your mind open to networking in many different ways. I mean, I think everybody's trying to learn from each other. So the more you can do that, the better.
Can't say it any better. We'll leave it there. Thank you again, Doug. Thank you on behalf of myself and my co-host Fahad. And thank you for those of you watching. We'll see you again. Cheers.
Thank you.